So I'm just going to go straight on and introduce this week's lecturer, who's Dr. Lucy Whelan, who's an honorary fellow in the Centre for Visual Arts and Culture and the School of Modern Languages and Cultures. And she's also a fairly recent member of our senior common room. So it's wonderful, Lucy, to have you willing to do this lecture for us tonight. And Lucy is an expert on the artist Marthe Bonnard. And her title tonight, as we know, is Seeing, Hiding and Finding Women in Modern Art, the Case of Marthe Bonnard. So Lucy, over to you, and thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. I won't start my PowerPoint just for a moment, don't need it too soon. Just to say thanks very much for all popping by or turning on or whatever words we have to use now that the word attendance doesn't quite apply. This isn't a talk that I've given anywhere else. I thought I kind of put it together for this evening, which is why it's perhaps imperfectly put together, because I kind of gave myself a bit of a time limit. And so forgive me if there are any patchy moments. I wanted to talk to you about the research I've done on Marthe Bonnard, which comes about as a sort of slightly like a side product of my PhD and then post-PhD process of writing a book on Marthe Bonnard, the artist himself. And I also wanted to make it a little bit relevant to thinking about the history of modern art in general, because although there was Bonnard's increasingly noticed, I think, he had a Tate Modern exhibition last year and has had quite a few, and a Tate exhibition many years before that, and in between lots of international shows. At the same time, many people still haven't heard of him, so I hope this will be relevant whether you come having heard of Bonnard or not. So I've titled the talk Seeing, Hiding, Finding Women in Modern Art, because these three words tell us much about how women have appeared in art's history. They've been seen by predominantly male artists. They or their truth has also been hidden or overlooked, not just in a passive or accidental way, but often, as we'll see today, actively hidden through the choices made by art historians and art critics. And today, the role of many women in art history is now being found or being made visible once again. And I use the word finding here because where women are showing up, there's often a story of archival or chance, but discoveries. And this is the tripartite story that I want to tell today in relation in particular to Marthe Bonnard. Marthe Bonnard, wife and model of the major modern painter Marthe Bonnard, has long been slandered and had her real life story distorted and mythologized in order to prop up a certain interpretation of Bonnard's life and work. One of a painter of colour and joy, or bonheur, and also as one of quite a realist painter, such that when he paints his wife in the bathtub, which he's famous for doing, there's this idea that that's really because she must have spent a lot of time in the bath. And some of these things will come up through today. So I want to talk also about the role of Marthe in the work of this important painter, and the way that his works encourage us to rethink the history of seeing women in modern art. But first, I just want to reflect for a few minutes on the wider context and structures of women in the history of modern art in particular. So I don't need a slide of Velázquez nude or Rubens to persuade you that through centuries Western art history, the female body is offered an attractive but passive surface against which painters and sculptors could practice their art. I don't need to exhibit yet more creamy flesh in order to convince you of that, I'm sure. But I think what is worth briefly dwelling on is just how much the visual arts have lagged behind in terms of the developments in the social and cultural history of women's equality. So from the 1890s, which saw the first substantial legal changes for women's rights, through to women's involvement in the Great War, so many periods of so many changes happened around the fin de siècle in women's history, and saw transformations in the agency of women. And perhaps with this kind of thing in mind. One French critic, Camille Mauclair, wrote on the eve of the new century in November 1899, and he made his predictions for what the coming years would bring. He said that until then, he claimed, images of women had traditionally been viewed as little more than, quote, a motif of colour, of decorative and supple forms, rather than as psychological subjects. But he sort of then started to contemplate the fact that artists had only begun, mind you, to bestow upon the contemporary woman all the worries and responsibilities of the modern man. She acquires an equivalent personality. He wrote, she almost thinks, almost. A new woman is being elaborated, he warned. A new woman to which a new form of painting will have to correspond. So in some senses, he's observing the changes in his time. Obviously, the First World War obviously hadn't happened at this point, but he's looking forward to the coming century, the 20th century. But was he right? And I think the answer is largely no. Because what virile artist would willingly give up his most malleable form, the human female body? Picasso, and here I do need to start sharing my screen. There we go, should work. Oh, I hope that's worked. Good, thanks for the nods. So Picasso, oh, I'm screen sharing, but there we go. Picasso, the artist, famous for making his own virility into an art form, transformed and experimented with the bodies of his female muses, twisting them and turning them and fragmenting them. Then you have surrealists like Man Ray and Hans Bellmer, who manipulated and fetishized the female body, cutting it up into fragments, creating life-size dolls. Very rarely there were modern female artists like Marie Laurencin, who found some success, but only then by playing on their femininity, specifically with pink, sugary paintings. Or think of Sonia Delaunay, who limited herself to despite being a very talented artist, to the traditionally feminine areas of craft and costume design. So actually, when we think of the modernist avant-garde, Picasso and so on, we think of human creativity at its most provocative and most subversive or anti-orthodox. But when it comes to gender, this modernism was actually traditional to its core. If any artist can make us view this differently, I believe that in some ways, perhaps ironically, it's Pierre Bonnard. I say ironically because he's not thought of as avant-garde as Picasso or the Surrealists, for example. So a little bit about Bonnard. His career ran from Fin de siècle Paris to his shimmering canvases of the 20s, 30s and 40s, during which time he was as well known as Matisse and Picasso. Matisse even called him the best of us all. In the years following his death, Bonnard was rather forgotten, owing to a scandalous court case, which we'll come to later. But he was, in his time, also famously detested by the hyper-masculine Picasso, for his art is, if anything, slightly feminine. His interiors and garden scenes caught many female-gendered tropes. They're painted in tremulous and brilliantly coloured brushstrokes. They show an almost total absence of strong lines and shadows. There is a long-standing division in the history of art between lines standing for kind of masculine values and colour and standing for much softer feminine values. That goes back to at least the 18th century, not before. And this colour, sort of effervescent colour, was everything Picasso hated, and it's something that Picasso made very clear. Now, I'm not suggesting that Bonnard was a feminist artist. That will become, I hope, very clear. But I think in other ways too, he does complicate the history that we normally tell in art history and film studies and various other subjects of the male gaze. That is the controlling and desirous gaze that so many paintings and photos and movies have been found to adopt. So just to clarify, and this is a little bit of a diversion, but I think it's an interesting one. So talk about the male gaze. The male gaze, you don't have to be male to be complicit in the male gaze. The male gaze is what happens when any of us take pleasure in identifying with the active point of view that's offered to us, and it's usually male. And because it subjects the female to being a passive object of the gaze. It's a gaze that's forged for the viewer by the artist or the filmmaker. Films do this a lot. So a film often seems to look from a male point of view, and it asks us to look from that point of view too. In the dark cinema, you become a man. No prizes actually for guessing the film I'm going to about to show. I don't know if anyone will know. You become a man. You become the man looking on. From the crowd at the woman dancing. You're sat in the dark of the cinema and you see from that point of view. You become the man that sees what this man sees from the balcony. I just realised on my screen the man in this is hidden in the bottom right hand corner, because that's where I've got all the pictures of you, but there's a man looking down. And so it's the male gaze that controls the cinematic cut, the angles we see from, and that's what I mean by the male gaze. So how is Bonnard a little bit different from this? Well, his works famously centre around one woman, his wife and model, who I've already mentioned, known as Marthe. Incidentally, I am aware that calling her Marthe might seem like a little bit of a disparity because I'm calling him Bonnard and I'm not honouring her with a surname. There are reasons for that. She had a really complicated relationship, I think, to her surnames. Plus, this is what her friends called her in her time. So I just make the decision to call her Marthe while being aware that that doesn't necessarily accord her the same respect in the same way that we call Bonnard, not Pierre. So this is a photograph of the two of them together. And from the first time they met in 1893 until Bonnard's death decades later in 1947, Bonnard painted and drew Marthe in hundreds of paintings and probably thousands of drawings. She appears in his diaries, the agenda that he kept in his jacket pocket, and where across the printed succession of days, and he had one of these diaries from every year, she assumes endlessly varying positions, mostly bathing, drying herself, taking tea, sitting in the garden. His work constantly returns to her. In fact, I think it seems to inscribe the experience of living with her within an intimate yet quotidian domestic situation. And at the end of his life, even after her death, he was still painting her lying in the bathtub in works like Nu dans le bain. Now, you might say that painting Marthe in the bath, painting her while she takes tea, is slightly voyeuristic and shows the same kind of male gaze as we see in the work of Edgar Degas decades earlier, in paintings or actually pastels like this one. Now, these paintings by Degas, and he's not alone, mostly invite a kind of voyeuristic spectatorship. The viewer gets the pleasure of watching a woman do something, sort of enact her toilette, from watching her from behind a curtain, or almost as if through a keyhole, from some kind of position of non-communication. But Bonnard's paintings, I think, are slightly different from this. And you do have to see, here I'm only able to show you one or two, you do have to see a number of Degas paintings and a number of Bonnard paintings to make these kind of generalizations. But Bonnard's paintings strongly assert the presence of the artist in a way that voyeuristic images do not. Lots of his paintings even explicitly include fragments of his own body, like this leg down the bottom left-hand corner, like in this work called Le Grand Nu Bleu, and also in, I've left it, here we go. He's in, I think that's him in the background there in Nu dans le baignoire, wearing a dressing gown. So there's a very kind of bodily present looking, with the result that there's a continuous sense that the artist was really there in the same small room as Marthe. Bonnard's model could not fail to be aware of his close presence. And so I'm not saying that this is ideal or feminist, instead but it's different. It suggests a kind of almost marital titillation occurring within the privacy of the bathroom. So whereas the male gaze, as it's classically conceived, invites the viewer to see from its perspective and indulge in its pleasures, Bonnard's works, I don't think, do this. essentially, I think there is a bigger argument here, but to skim over it, and you're welcome to ask me questions about it later, they play with point of view, as you can see simply already from the couple of paintings I've shown you there. They seem to almost try to distract the viewer with this unresolvable puzzle of ambiguous shapes that goes on around Marthe, and this various areas of visual interest that seem to surround her body, almost trying to distract the viewer's gaze away from her own body. And she also ages I think very clearly in the paintings. She's not simply presented as an object for the pleasure of the viewer. It's as if Bonnard is inside the room with her. He has access, but he almost seems to protect the viewer from sharing the same access that he has to his model. Second, whereas the male gaze is always thought of as the active and controlling gaze, instead it seems to be Bonnard that follows Marthe around the house. In his works, she always seems so intensely absorbed in her own activities, taking tea or in her toilette. This isn't, in a sense, self-determining in any radical political sense, but it is a kind of absorption in what she's doing. And yes, certainly there were other artists like Cézanne. This is a painting of his wife Hortense, who had their wives model for them, but they always sit in these kinds of works. The artist's wife sits obligingly. But Bonnard's works, by contrast, and I think he's very unusual here, if not unique, construct this sense that he expects the model to pay him no attention whatsoever. She slips away in and out at the picture's edge. Like this one here, she's almost hiding on the left. She moves through doorways. She seems to be evasive, as instead Bonnard follows her. I almost imagine him holding his little agenda sketchbook as she just flows through her daily life. She moves from room to room, and rather than him positioning her, she kind of leads the way. Again, I'm not suggesting that Bonnard is somehow producing perfect feminist works, but this idea of the male gaze is such a construct in history of art and film studies, as I've said. And I think Bonnard gets us to rethink some of these structures in really fascinating ways. I also think that Marthe played a huge role in structuring and shaping Bonnard's art. She wasn't just a passive surface, as women have so often been. It was when they met in 1893 and he started producing erotic sketches of her, that was when his work immediately evolved and subsequently took off in popularity. And perhaps no wonder, it's not just the way he rendered her, it's who he was rendering. Here, for example, is a painting from 1893 that became of Marthe that became an illustration in a popular magazine. And there's a very particular social type that they depict. It's not a prostitute, it's not a chaste ideal, nor is it a bourgeois woman. And actually, I haven't perhaps picked the best picture here to exemplify this, but when you see others of his works, it's a very specific social type. A woman of whom there were very many in Paris and fascinated many writers and artists at the time. Well, I say artists, not so many artists, but certainly writers at the time. A certain kind of young woman from the working classes, from the provinces, who'd come to Paris to work in one of the many trades there that women could work in. And it's at a time when, yes, this kind of woman was preoccupying bohemians in the city. And so by portraying Marthe in these sexually charged works from the 1890s, he marks himself out as an artist producing this kind of work for this new era, showing a woman kind of used to urban bohemian life. It's actually her that really makes his career in the 1890s in a way that we tend not to acknowledge. And I'll come back to this, but for now, I'd like to just move on to thinking about how women have been seen in the history of art to how they have been hidden. So I've recently, So I've recently been, well, not recently, but over the last several years in my research, kind of wanting to know a little bit more about Marthe, and I contacted an archivist who I sort of found a tiny story in a local newspaper on the internet and realised that he'd done a little bit of research into her. And I've realised how the stories that we've been told about her have not quite tallied with have seemed suspicious. Let's say that for now. And so until now, we've had a very different understanding of Marthe's life. Sorry, I realise I'm flitting around a bit at the moment. Let me tell you about the understanding of Marthe's life that we've had up till now. So the widely told story of Marthe's life is that of this young woman working in a fancy flower shop in Fin de Siècle, Paris, who in 1893 collided on the street with a bourgeois bohemian artist, and then she became his constant muse until her death in 1942. She's said to have lied in introducing herself. Apparently she claimed to be an orphan of noble Italian heritage called Marthe de Méligny, and actually her real name was Maria Boursin. And then, as the story goes, as time wore on, she quite quickly became increasingly neurotic, demanding, paranoid, antisocial, and she dragged Bonnard away from Paris and where his friends were to spa resorts and warmer areas of France, and that this is why he had to work in the south of France for most of his late career, and he didn't really want to, is always the implication. In 1925, the couple married, but apparently it was only because actually the jealous Marthe wished to prevent Bonnard from marrying a woman that he passionately loved far more than neurotic, crazy Marthe Bonnard, called Renée Montchatti. And so she was jealous about this Renée Montchatti affair, and Marthe forced Bonnard to wed her instead. And that's apparently the reason they got married in 1925. So it's reputedly, we're always told that Montchatti, Bonnard's lover, killed herself as a result of this. So this is the way the story goes. Bonnard's muse was also his jailer. So when I was doing my PhD, I found that these myths just seemed too much to fit with too many stereotypes of women. It always seemed to be her holding him back, even though ultimately he's producing loads of works and probably doing various things suggest that he was probably pretty much doing what he wanted. And the idea that she was generally difficult, hysterical, neurotic, but without actually any really hard evidence for this other than accounts from the family, it just seemed again to fit too much with ways that women were seen in the past, especially working class women. So I found this archivist, as I mentioned, working in a local archive in Ville Saint-Amand-Montrond, which is where Marthe grew up. And I contacted him, and he gave me a few leads to find some documents relating to her life. So we now know a little more about her. She was born in 1869 in this provincial town, and she was the fifth of 7 children, 2 of whom didn't survive beyond infancy. Her father was a carpenter, and he died when she was only 6, leaving her mother alone with 5 children, 4 girls and a baby boy. One of the older girls, her sister, later died when Marthe was just 10. By the end of the 1880s, this is when she probably moved to Paris with her mother and her sisters Aline and Adèle, where they lived in the 9th arrondissement. Her eldest sister, Aline, was certainly working in Paris at that time as a fleuriste, so something to do with flowers, when she died. And that was when Marthe was 17, so losing yet another sibling. And there's a long-standing claim that Marthe also worked with artificial flowers. That's kind of all we know. It conjures to mind a pretty girlish image, but actually just a small amount of research shows that if this is true, probably it meant either a shop assistant arranging bouquets, but perhaps even more likely it meant the painful and dangerous work of an artificial flower maker for the millinery hat-making industry. But in either case, the reality is that she would have worked punishingly long hours and most likely earning less than, on average, 3 francs a day, with difficulty because the seasons also fluctuated, and so often living off a lot less than that. So while this picture has been painted of Marthe Bonnard, a woman who was sort of a midinette, as her class was called, whose life was spent prettily trotting along the pavements of Paris, waiting to bump into a bohemian artist, in fact, her life was very different from that. The other thing that this archivist found, but didn't do all that much with, and gave me a tip off to find for myself, was that on her own brother's death certificate in 1899, so that's several years, maths is terrible, 6 years after she met Bonnard, Marthe signed herself on her brother's death certificate as the wife of a Monsieur Renard, and she gave an address that is in no way connected to Bonnard as 94 Rue Lafayette in Paris. It's a pretty astounding find, actually, because we have for so long assumed that Marthe, from the moment she met Bonnard in 1893 to her death in 1942, was Bonnard's constant muse. But actually, she seems to have been, for some time, married to another man. It's quite funny, really, that this major story was in a tiny local newspaper. So it just shows that actually there are things out there, you just have to know what to do with them. So, I mean, at first I could barely believe the story, and not least because she's constantly in his paintings. Marthe is constantly in Bonnard's work. And then I started to look again. Actually, when you look at the catalogue raisonné of Bonnard's works, from about 1899 to about 1906, Marthe kind of disappears. There are women who look a lot like Marthe, but they aren't her. And she slowly starts to come back around 1905, 1906, but actually not nude, but dressed rather smartly. Oh, sorry, that's another early work in which she appears. Here she is, dressed rather smartly in 1906, and it's called Madame Bonnard with her dog. So other things started to make sense too. About the same time, the year 1899, Bonnard stops working on all these avant-garde images, like the one I showed you before, and his work producing this kind of stuff really ceases altogether. The woman who made it possible in the first place seems to have vanished, and he painted a self-portrait with Marthe in that year. Oh well, he first painted the sketch for it, 1899, and it's titled Man and Woman. And this work has long puzzled art historians because of this psychological barrier between the man and the woman on one side and the other, that it's so dramatically split by a screen. Well, this puzzling painting now has a really obvious explanation. Of course, it's marking the split between the two of them. So in fact, suddenly, something that didn't seem possible all seemed to fall into place. So, So I think one of the most important things I take from this gap is that it wasn't just Bonnard's skill, but it's almost further proof that it's Marthe's identity that made the drawings and prints of her that he produced so popular around the fin de siècle. And as I piece these things together, in other ways too, Marthe began to take on a life of her own. In particular because her life was of a very different, it proved how her life was of a very different class, and she had a very different set of experiences from Bonnard and from his milieu of wealthy bourgeois artists and their families, and the people that she would go on to mix with for the rest of her life. In light of this, her negative reputation seemed even more suspect, because the accounts of Marthe, I was realising, were written by Bonnard's family and very close family friends, and they just seemed to find her funny, baffling. They accused her of having an idea, quote, of personal adornment as nothing but cheap finery. And they said she seemed like a little bird because she couldn't walk properly in her heels and she used to hop around, and that she had a savage, harsh voice that they also seemed to find quite amusing. Again, these ideas of Marthe as neurotic and hysterical and obsessed with bathing become even more suspect when it's coming from these accounts. Yet nobody had really questioned them. And every time there's an exhibition about Bonnard, we get articles in newspapers, and there were some in the Telegraph and other papers last year with the Tate exhibition of Bonnard, talking about Bonnard's neurotic, crazy wife, as if she'd been crazy all of her life. But it gradually became apparent to me that actually all of the accounts of her come from after Bonnard's death, of her as crazy, come from after Bonnard's death. Before Bonnard's death, she's hardly mentioned at all, but it was as if after the artist's death, they were free to blacken her reputation. What's more, I realised that all of the accounts that described Marthe in these terms were accounts by those who were involved in a court case that I mentioned earlier that followed Bonnard's death, a court case which effectively pitched Marthe's heirs against Bonnard's own. So I'll try to start this court case very briefly. There's much more to be said, and the accounts of it have been written elsewhere. But Marthe died in 1942 without having made a will. Now, according to the French law of droit de suite, essentially, as Bonnard's legal wife, because they married in 1925, remember, her inheritors would inherit half of Bonnard's entire estate, unless she'd had specified otherwise, which she didn't, because she didn't make a will. So Bonnard, retrospectively, after her death, faked her will, so that to say, oh, I don't want my half, it can all go to Bonnard's family. So Bonnard's family effectively would then have inherited everything. However, after Bonnard's death, the fake will that he wrote was revealed as fake. And then he was posthumously, Bonnard, the great artist, was posthumously found guilty of the crimes of fraud and of handling stolen goods, because he had effectively defrauded Marthe's inheritors. Now, it's kind of understandable. Nobody really knew much about these inheritors. They were a pair of sisters living in England who barely had heard of Bonnard, whereas his family he was very close to. So you can understand the motive, but nevertheless, in the eyes of the law, he had defrauded these two women. And of a lot of money, a lot of canvases, and the penalty for this was that his inheritors were to give over the entire estate to these two sisters living in England who'd never really heard of Bonnard. You can understand why it caused some scandal. So that's hundreds of canvases worth a lot of money at the time. And so on, and his family also lost, I think they felt, the reputation of their uncle as an honest, good artist. So in 1953, Daniel Wildenstein, of the big heavyweight art dealer family, the Wildensteins, approaches the Terrasse family, which is Bonnard's family, with $1 million, saying, you can have $1 million if you give me a lot of the rights to the painting, something like that. But he approached them with $1 million on the basis that they went to appeal. So they said, okay, let's appeal this court ruling. And they did that by proving that Bonnard, and they successfully appealed it. They won back all the paintings and everything. How did they do that? They did it by proving that Bonnard had no idea about Marthe's family. He couldn't have committed fraud because he didn't know there was anyone he was defrauding. So this required making Marthe out to be so strange that the weird woman, in the decades they spent together, never once told him about the niece that she wrote postcards to, never once told him she had a family. This is also the beginning, to my knowledge, this is the first public evidence for the court case, it's the first public moment that this idea that she told Bonnard that she was an orphan when they met arrives anywhere in the literature. And over the years, so there's this court case, and this is the first time you sort of hear of her as being really crazy when you're reading the account of the court case. And it's in the years and decades that follow that court case that those who were partisan in it and gave testimony saying, yes, she was very strange, have written these accounts of Marthe, kind of backing up their original testimony, I think, written these accounts of her as neurotic and secretive and paranoid, accounts that have been taken at face value ever since. What's more, I should add that the testimony of Bonnard's family, so this is extremely suspicious, and what's more, the testimony of Bonnard's family has already been proven untrue on a few occasions. They actually told various contradictory stories about Bonnard's purported lover, René Monchatti. They said she died in a Paris hotel after filling her bed with white lilac, that she died in a bathtub in Rome, various contradictory ideas. And in 1998, an art historian dug out the death certificate of Bonnard's purported lover, and showed that the details on that death certificate completely contradicted all the self-contradictory stories that Bonnard's heirs had put forward up to that point. At this time, you would really think that that might have raised alarm bells about all the other stories they were telling, and yet it didn't. That's partly to do with the state of writing on Bonnard, which is catalogue essays, which tend to I guess curators only have so much time. It's a good thing about doing a PhD. You have a lot of time to dig into things properly. These catalogue essays recycle the same old quotes. You look at the footnote and it just references another catalogue essay. So they didn't go back to the original source and start thinking about why that original source might have been written in the way that it was. So it's a bit of a shame that the Tate exhibition last year started insisting on calling Marthe by her surname that she chose of de Meligny, based on the idea, this kind of idea that I think is pretty dubious, because while they did it with the best of intentions, they wanted to give Marthe a name that dignified her. In fact, it's a name that may be a almost complete fabrication. So it's kind of ironic, really. And in particular, this trial is the court case following Bonnard's death is the first, as I've kind of said, the first time we really get the story of her mental derangement. So in short, crazy Marthe was a scapegoat to preserve Bonnard as a painter of innocence, a painter of bonheur, and also to win back an awful lot of money. Now there is, I should say, some evidence, I'll wrap up shortly because I'm sure I've talked for long enough, but there is some evidence of Marthe of having become difficult towards the end of her life. Bonnard's letters do make reference to her as having become quite antisocial. So there's kind of no smoke without fire, to use the old cliche. But the first evidence for this in Bonnard's letters are in the early 1930s, when he writes of her as having become antisocial, as if, really suggesting that she's just becoming this way. That's in the beginning of her early 60s. She dies in 1942. She's also spent a lifetime being looked at in being pinned up on the walls of exhibitions, having her friends look at her in the nude while she bathes in bathtubs. So it seems she turned antisocial effectively when she was in her early 60s. Now, average life expectancy, and after a very, very difficult life, of a difficult early life, and in its own way, a difficult later life. And don't forget that average life expectancy around this time was age 66 for women. So I just hope that, this is judging somebody perhaps if we're judging her at all on the basis of Bonnard's letters. People have said, but Bonnard wrote that she was crazy. Yes, but we leap from what he says about her when she's in the very, very last portion of her life to claiming that this was her personality wholesale. And that really needs to be distinguished between, I hope none of us are judged on what we're like in our very final years, really. It's complete. She's been completely, her reputation has been completely blackened. So I think we need to approach her completely more empathetically, and also with a greater understanding of her role in Bonnard's painting and what she contributed to it. See that she wasn't just a passive surface. And I said I'm finding women in the history of art. I know that I'm not claiming entirely to have found Marthe. I don't think my work aims to replace one set of false stories on her with a new set. It's unclearly we see her, and draw attention to the unreliability of the evidence on which we've written so many stories about neurotic, crazy Marthe who was in the bath all the time. It is an interesting question that I'd just like to finish on, as to why it's taken so long for the bias in the testimony against her to become visible. I mean, yes, you can uncover her secret marriage in a dusty archive. That was not available for anyone to see. That was new. But the fact that the court case happened and the partisan nature of the accounts there, that was available for people to, that's been available for people to see for decades. So why did it remain unseen? I think the answer is that, as I said, I did mention the recycling of quotes and the fact that that has helped to obscure things. But I think it's also that and the fact that nobody has questioned things enough. I think this points to the value of doing things properly in the humanities, the value of doing long and large scale projects at something like PhD level rather than the level at which curators are able to write exhibition catalogue essays. But also, I think it draws attention to the way we prefer to talk about women, the fact that the art world has preferred to recycle stories ultimately about a deeply secretive and strange woman turning hysterical and difficult in middle age, because these are stories that ultimately satisfy the deep-held prejudices of viewers, or at the very least match our unconscious expectations of what we think women are like. If we didn't have these expectations, then maybe we would have found these stories suspicious a little bit earlier. I certainly think that we hold a higher standard of evidence as society to call a man crazy than we do to call a woman crazy. I think perhaps also that maybe believing Marthe was mad somehow might dispel the unease that we should or might feel when we stand in an exhibition looking at painting after painting of her as she goes about her most intimate of daily routines. Perhaps we feel less uncomfortable about that invasive access to her everyday life if we can diminish her individuality and reduce Bonnard's iridescent paintings that are doing all sorts of complicated things into metaphors of one woman's decline. And so, yes, I hope that, like one of Bonnard's paintings, we can now see that the rich layers of Marthe's life extend beyond what's visible at the surface. So yeah, thanks for listening. Very, very happy. Would love to hear your questions and thoughts.
So thank you very much, Lucy. So we now have a few minutes for questions or comments. And what we found works fairly well is if you wanted to just note in the chat that you have a question or a comment that you'd like to make. You don't have to write it out there because that would take too long. But if you can just indicate to me, since I can't see all of you on the screen at the same time, but I'll keep an eye on the chat to see who would like to have a question. There's no one on the chat yet, so if anyone has a question that they just want to kind of throw in there right at the outset without having to indicate, please just unmute yourself and go for it.
Oh, I can see someone speaking, but I can't hear you very well.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
David,
hello. Thanks for the very interesting talk. I was just wondering, where do you kind of position Marthe in terms of changes that are taking place for women generally in kind of turn of the century society? Just thinking, you mentioned, I was just wondering where she kind of fits in terms of the emerging women's movement, if you could call it that.
Yeah. So there are a few different names given to types of women at this time. People enjoy typecasting, the kind of there's a modern woman in particular, and I think she's loosely one of them. Something that's not too often said about Bonnard's work is that one of the reasons it was popular may have later in the 20th century was that here too, she provides an identity that was really fashionable and interesting at the time. So she has her bobbed haircut, which you might have seen in a couple of the paintings, although actually I don't think I showed any that had it. But she always seems to wear heels all the time and bobbed hair. And they also have a bathroom that would be in the height of fashion in the 1930s, linoleum fitted fixtures. So something that actually I think is a study that I haven't done. It hasn't been my main focus, but I think there's definitely a project for a PhD student or something, another PhD to come along there. or a master's student, is how Bonnard's paintings play into fashionable ideas of the modern liberated woman, in which you see so many images of women with bob haircuts in 1930s and 20s magazines standing by cars and so on. She's absolutely exemplifying that. I don't think she had particularly a radical agenda. I think she enjoyed fashion, and she was a kind of modern woman in that classic sense, in that kind of sense, rather than being, and the name has completely escaped me,
Virginia Woolf.
the
Is that what you
more,
think of?
no. There's a more radical typecast of woman that is much more political type.
Yeah.
That I don't think she was. Although Bonnard had lots of links to anarchists in the 1890s. It's interesting that they didn't get married until 1925. By which point they'd been together for a long time. Now, obviously, discovering her secret marriage raises questions around that. There's a small possibility that perhaps they didn't get married until 1925 because they were waiting for the death or divorce from Monsieur Renard.
Yeah.
However, it also could be that there were ideas flowing through Bonnard's circles of marriage from the 1890s onwards, of marriage as a bourgeois institution and that kind of thing. Bonnard's political ideas is something in which there's not very much evidence.
Because he wasn't particularly political, is that what you're saying?
He definitely had anarchist friends and anarchist associations in the 1890s. He doesn't do anything overtly political himself, but it's hard to say. His work is very individualist, and in a sense, anarchism at that time, there is a kind of it's called individualist anarchism. Yeah. And so simply being individualist and seemingly apolitical can actually stand for a certain kind of anarchism that is in itself a political stance. Yeah. So what could seem like an absence of politics from him and from his work could in a sense be it's because of that position being a position at that time, could in itself be a political sort of stance in its own right.
Like a nihilist kind of.
Yeah, I think that relates to it. That is definitely a related position, kind of nihilism, anarchist. Yeah.
Thank you, David and Lucy.
Thank you.
So I think Dick had a question, and then I'm going to Peter. So Dick, if you unmute yourself, and we'll hear your question.
Bottom left to unmute yourself.
Unmute.
Hang on, bottom left.
Dick, we can't hear you. You'll need to press the unmute button.
Hello, is that right?
That's great. Yeah. Yes, we can hear you now. Thank you.
1942 is an extraordinary year to have died in, because in her last years, by the way, I ought to say, I was saying before I was unmuted, thank you very much for that talk, which I greatly enjoyed. 1942 has seen in previous years the rise of fascism, the total collapse of France and French society. Is there any evidence that either Marthe or Pierre had any kind of response or reaction to the rise of fascism in Germany, the anti-Semitism in France, the general political febrile atmosphere that led to the collapse in 1939-1940?
Sorry, hang on. My PowerPoint's doing something odd. There. That's a really interesting question. It's something I've asked myself quite a lot. I must admit that I asked myself that question a lot at the beginning of my PhD. It's something that I haven't thought about that much since, partly because I didn't come up with any hard answers, and so it didn't become a theme in my work, if you like. So basically, there's nothing strong either way. It's quite interesting the extent to which Bonnard, he's not alone, Matisse is the same, really managed to abstract themselves from what's going on at this time in a way that, for example, Picasso, painter of Guernica, doesn't. I mean, they do write to one another, saying, Bonnard and Matisse, their correspondence, they have letters in which they express their kind of sense of guilt that they can't really do anything. They feel they're of a generation a little too old. And Matisse, and I can't remember his words precisely, effectively says that he thinks the only thing he can do is keep producing joyful pictures that put pleasure into the world, because he can't do anything else. In the First World War, Bonnard did do a few paintings of there's a kind of liberation kind of a picture. It's not liberation, obviously, as such. I can't remember its exact name. And he did paint a few kind of industrial scenes that relate to the war, but even then, that was for a really short period of time. There is a kind of rumour that I don't think I ever found a really good source for, that Bonnard refused something like, I should remember this, but it's been years since I came across it, that Bonnard refused to paint a portrait of Vichy. But he did send a painting to the 1937 exhibition, which was a major exhibition that really kind of tried to put Paris and France on quite a nationalistic world stage, suggesting that he did have some support for the state at that point. And actually, I would, if you don't mind me just sharing my screen again, I would love to see what you actually think. I mean, really anyone, all of you, what you think about this. Hang on, because this this painting, 1930. So he actually took a long time to paint it. It was due to be in the 1937 exhibition. It was painted for that. The director talked to him about it. Bonnard took a long time to finish his painting, so it did take a couple of years to paint in the end. But I see a tricolour in this painting. Blue, white, red. Right at the back, obvious as you like, once you've seen it, and yet in other ways completely hidden. If you see what I mean, the tiles, the bathroom tiles. And when you think about the fact that this was the painting that he painted for the 1937 International Paris exhibition, I think that there's a tricolour, and so there's a sense of nationalism there. You could say that's a complete coincidence. He couldn't have intended a tricolour. I'm kind of curious about this because I maybe stopped sharing my screen now, but because I have recently had my book reader, I sent on my book manuscript, and I've had the reader reports back. And for the first time, one of the readers said, so they were very positive about the book, I'm glad to say, but they said, I couldn't see the tricolour in that painting. Oh no, is it just me? So I'm glad I'm seeing a couple of nods. Okay, oh, thank you. Okay, yeah, well, that's good.
Thank you very much.
So, okay, good. So it's really, he's really, again, he's very silent on it. And yeah, but thanks for absolutely apt question. Yeah.
Thank you, Dick. Peter, you had a question.
Yes, thank you.
Oh, I can't hear, and I don't know if that's my signal. Oh no, you're muted. There we go. Now you're unmuted.
Yes, that's
okay.
Fine.
Can you hear?
Yes, yeah, can now.
You can hear me. I'll shout.
No, that's fine.
I really enjoyed it. Thank you so much. And my question is not useful unless your experience matches mine. I want to relate what you've been doing to a very recent instance, which seems to me a parallel. There's been 3, to my mind, excellent programs about the Salisbury poisonings. And one of the things that those programs were doing is correcting or rebalancing appropriately the images that people have, particularly images of the one woman who died in the Salisbury poison has been portrayed in the media as a kind of dissolute drunkard. And there was a really careful and beautifully executed restoration of her, not as somebody without problems or difficulties. And it just struck me as showing how this restitution of people from certain kind of female categories and assumptions still has to go on, particularly when it comes to media representations. So, as I say, I'm sorry if you've never seen any of these programs, you probably quite know what I'm talking about, but I'd be glad if you...
Yeah, thank you. I had wondered about whether to watch them, so I will now, but I haven't yet. Though you are absolutely right, and what you made me think about is another program that I wondered about watching on Jade Goody, of all people. And I never paid any attention to Jade Goody, and then somebody wrote an interesting piece not that long ago that caught my eye, and I realised that actually she came to stand for a kind of, dare I say the words, kind of low-life trash woman in culture as a whole, and actually she wasn't as simple as that, and she really died still not just slandered, but like deeply slandered everything that her type of woman stood for in a deeply unfair way. I think there was a channel 4 or something program about her that I think from the sound of it aimed to give a more complex portrait of who she was. And so yeah, you're right that these kind of ways in which we have deep held ideas about women that then effectively play into then we look for stories and images that play into confirmation bias, in which we find those stories and ideas we have about women reflected back at us. I think that happens all of the time, really. And so no wonder ideas and stereotypes don't die when the images that the media enjoy picking up on are ones that confirm the biases that we already have. And again, I think that's the reason why long-term research projects that have the time and space to look beyond these kinds of feedback loops of confirmation are so important. Yeah. So yeah, thank you. Thanks very much for making that point.
So Lucy, if I could slip a question in. So at what point in your research did you kind of make these discoveries, and how did you feel about them, and how quickly were you aware this is amazingly significant, this could rewrite how people see this artist?
All the way along, every time I read about Marthe, I thought, God, that just seems so neatly to fit with the general stereotypes that it almost can't be true. And I wanted to have a chapter on her in my thesis. This is, I don't know if we have any students here. It doesn't look like too many, so maybe this is.
There are a few.
Yeah, so it was kind of interesting because I wanted to make sure my thesis had something on her, even though it's not the kind of work that I predominantly do. And so I did. I had a chapter on her, and I had a chapter, and the chapter both looked at her from the kind of angle that I've talked about today, but also dwelt more on what her role can tell us about Bonnard's art, the idea that he actually is he is following her around the house, and the femininity in his work and so on. And in my viva, I was told, oh, when you send it off to the publisher, do get rid of the bit about Marthe and all that social history, because it doesn't really fit. And I sat there in my viva with 2 male examiners thinking, I'm not just going to get rid of it. They said, yeah, we didn't like the bit where you went all feminist in chapter 2. But actually it was kind of great that they said that, because that made me take it out of the thesis. It was kind of a valuable thing, really, because they made me take it out of the thesis and think, actually, this is the part of my thesis that has probably got a wider audience in some ways. And then I wrote an article for a journal, for the Burlington magazine, and then I wrote something and that got picked up by the Guardian, and so totally kind of separate from my work, and yet always coming from the same place of trying to rethink Bonnard from the ground, not in any case, for all of the aspects of Bonnard that I was looking at, ever relying on recycled quotes, always going back to their origin, not kind of leaving any stone unturned, just use the cliche, and always rethinking things from scratch and trying to see him through new eyes without all of the kind of clutter that has accumulated through exhibition catalogues and things, while building obviously on good ideas, but also trying to see him afresh, because there has been so many false quotes. It's not just Marthe where there's been false quotes. Quotes have been recycled and recycled and recycled until when you go back to the original source, you realise that actually it's completely wrong. And when you get rid of some of the false quotes, things that Bonnard actually didn't say, and you find new ones, you get this whole new rereading of Bonnard as a whole. So Marthe is a part of that. But yes, it was frustrating to go to the Tate exhibition last year, where there were some really rotten things said about her in the audio guide, I thought, and so on. And I thought, if only I could get I could have got my article out before this rather than after. But I'm hoping that the next the next Bonnard exhibition, wherever it is, might just see Marthe differently.
And that leads to my follow-on question, and see then if anyone's got any final questions. But the follow-on question is this: I mean, it's quite hard, isn't it, for people to give up their myths or truths that have been around for a long time? And it may be too early for you to know the answer to this, but how is the kind of art world receiving this kind of turnaround in how she is seen? Do you know that yet? Are they resisting or?
I don't know. It's a really interesting question. I think it's going to be very interesting to see how it gradually gets soaked up. And I think it will gradually get soaked up rather than anything else. I'm half expecting and have been wondering if I'll get an email from someone in the art world kind of going, oh, you know, like the curator of the Tate Experience, going, oh, that's interesting. Because they insisted on calling her de Meligny. And they must have sent their press releases out saying you have to start calling her de Meligny, because for the first time ever, the woman who'd been known as Marthe in everything was suddenly called by this surname that actually first appears in this court case in all the journalists, all the newspapers as well. And I was kind of almost hoping they might get in touch and say, oh, that's interesting, but they haven't. But I mean, I guess it shows the ways that maybe things will soak up. A documentary maker from France has been in touch, and I think she sounds like she was making a documentary on Bonnard and Marthe anyway. And so I guess it will just be a gradual case of the next thing to happen on Marthe or on Bonnard will hopefully take this into account, and things will change gradually. I mean, I'm a little bit relieved. I should finish this answer, but a little bit relieved that there hasn't been anything too enormous, because quite honestly I have had little moments where I've reflected on the amounts of millions of pounds or dollars or euros that have been, and I mean really, really eye-watering sums of money that have effectively been involved here, and the fact that I am effectively saying that I am kind of saying that there was potentially some fabrication, because there was so much money at stake. Not fabrication, perhaps, but although that's insinuated, but you know, that there was a lot of money at stake and this evidence is unreliable, and I'm pointing out that people have actually given what's been proven to be unreliable evidence before. I'm glad to say that Bonnard's nephews, who wrote most of the books on Bonnard, really helps if you want to forge someone's reputation. If the nephew and also the other nephew both decide that you to choose careers as art historians, because then you can write like 10 books on Bonnard each, and hence that's how a reputation really gets solidified. And you kind of think, how have we not questioned the fact that his own nephews have written all the stuff on Bonnard that we're citing? But anyway, but I've honestly slightly, when I've reflected on the amounts of money involved, been a little bit worried that I'm not going to get not going to kind of get kidnapped in the back of a van or something. Honestly, I think my mum's been slightly worried. I've had to say, Mum, I don't think I'm going to be murdered. It's fine. Yeah. So yeah, I'm still alive. So I'm glad it hasn't made too big of a splash, because I feel safe in my bed at night.
Thank you. There's no more questions. I just want to say thank you, Lucy. That's been absolutely fascinating. And again, just I think as we've heard Lucy talk, a real privilege, because what we're seeing here, as we've seen on previous talks, no pressure for the rest of you to come, is actually the rewriting of one aspect of a discipline. And it's fascinating to kind of follow detective-wise and just see how Lucy has done that, and the kind of painstaking work and the kind of just determination not to let go, or not just to accept or receive truth, but to question it. So it's been fascinating at that level. It's been very interesting for me to kind of get to know an artist that I sort of know vaguely, but nothing much more than that, and to see just some of these just beautiful luminous images as well in the images that you've shared. So thank you for a wonderful lecture and a wonderful conversation after that. We're very, very grateful, and we look forward to when you can come and eat with us in the SCR in happier times. But shall we just, we can't particularly clap, but we can, I guess we can hold our hands up and give silent
well,
applause.
thank you all for your questions.
Say thank you very much, Lucy.
And I will be publishing the book very much eventually. In the meantime, I hadn't, thanks Margaret for that comment, because I hadn't really thought about the fact that that Bonnard isn't that well known, and if anyone is interested to read more about him, it's not perfect, couldn't be perfect, but there is a book by Timothy, a writer called Timothy Hyman, that is a wonderful read, and last time I looked, available for pennies on Amazon.
All right.
Called, it's one of these World, Thames and Hudson World of Art books, and it's beautifully written, and it's the best thing on Bonnard by a long way. Yes, anyway, so I'd recommend that if anyone's just interested in Bonnard in general.
And I think when it comes to, when your book actually comes out, then I think you must come into Chad's and do a proper book launch,
Yeah,
and tell us more, and just that we can check that you're okay and that you haven't been kind of kidnapped.
Yes.
Thank you, Lucy.
I've told all of you now, so if anything happens,
yeah,
you know,
we know the reason. Before everyone goes, I just want to say a little bit about the next talk, so the final one in our series. And before I talk about that, I've loved this series so far, actually. And I think if people are interested in continuing, not necessarily every week, but a little bit through the summer, then let me know. And if you've got suggestions or ideas, or you want to volunteer, then that would be lovely as well. But next week, we've deliberately tried to make these sessions very different, to appeal to different people, or exercise different parts of our brain, or learn about different areas that we may not know very much about. But I'm really delighted that next week, another newish member of the SCR, Chris Sparks, who's here this evening, give a wave. Chris Sparks, who's Chief Risk Officer for Atom Bank, is going to give us a talk entitled Commerce and COVID, or We're All Risk Managers Now. And it sounds fascinating. So Chris is going to be looking at what can we learn from models of risk in banking and finance, how we manage our own personal risk, and how the government is handling the national risks that we face. So a very different, but I think very interesting and obviously very topical lecture next week. So look forward very much to that, Chris. So thank you everyone for coming. Really good to see you. Thank you especially again to Lucy, you know, a very interesting hour or so. So bye everyone. See you next week, I hope. Bye Eddie, the dog.
See you again all. Thank you. Bye.
Great. Okay, bye-bye. Bye, Liz.